The city at night was a patchwork of light and shadow, vibrant yet detached. Emma sat on the worn cushion of her windowsill, nursing a lukewarm mug of tea. The window before her overlooked an expanse of buildings, a grid of lives playing out behind glass panes. Some apartments were darkened, the occupants already asleep or out for the night. Others glowed with the warmth of domesticity, families, couples, and the occasional lone figure like herself. But her attention wasn't on those windows. Across the street's summit tower rose like a gleaming specter, its sharp angles and mirrored facade making it appear both futuristic and oddly sterile. Emma had been watching it for weeks, ever since she'd noticed the dark window on the 47th floor. Unlike the other windows, this one was not a reflective surface casting back the city lights. It was black, a deep, impenetrable void that seemed to swallow light rather than bounce it away. At first, she dismissed it as an oversight by the architects, an anomaly in an otherwise flawless structure. But the longer she looked, the more it unnerved her. It wasn't just the window's appearance, it was the feeling it gave her, the nagging sensation that she was being watched. She shook her head and turned away, trying to focus on the sketchbook balanced on her lap. Charcoal smudged her fingers as she worked on a drawing of the skyline, her lines rough and impatient. Her hand moved automatically, capturing the contours of the buildings, the play of light and shadow. But when she glanced down at her progress, her stomach dropped. The dark window was the focal point of the sketch, standing out in stark contrast to the rest of the scene. She didn't remember adding that much detail to it. The depth of the blackness, the faint impression of something within. It almost looked like a figure. She closed the sketchbook with a snap, her pulse quickening. It's just a window, she told herself, but the reassurance felt hollow. The following day, Emma tried to distract herself with errands. She wandered through the bustling city streets, her camera slung over her shoulder. Photography had always been her solace, a way to ground herself in the tangible world. But even as she snapped shots of street performers and neon signs, her mind kept drifting back to the dark window. When she returned home that evening, the feeling of unease was worse. The apartment felt wrong, smaller, darker, as if the shadows lingered a little too long in the corners. She ignored it, setting her camera on the desk and collapsing onto the couch. Her phone buzzed with a message from her neighbor, Mr. Grant. "Do you see it too, on the 47th floor?" Her heart skipped a beat. Mr. Grant was an older man, quiet but friendly, the kind of neighbor who offered unsolicited advice about fixing a leaky faucet or where to find the best bagels. She hadn't spoken to him in weeks, yet his message felt oddly timed. Emma typed back, "The window, what about it?" His reply came almost immediately. "Don't look at it for too long. That's how it starts." Her hand tightened around the phone. Before she could respond, another message arrived. "Just don't. Trust me." That night, the tapping began. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of traffic. Emma sat upright in bed, straining to hear. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone drumming their fingers against glass. She crept to the window, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Pulling back the curtain, she peered outside. The street below was empty, save for the occasional flicker of headlights. The tapping stopped. She leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. Across the street, Summit Tower stood in silent grandeur. The dark window stared back at her, as blank and lifeless as ever. And then she saw it. A shadow moved behind the glass, subtle, almost imperceptible, but there. It wasn't a trick of the light or her imagination. Something shifted, a faint outline of a figure, too indistinct to identify. Emma stumbled back, her heart racing. She fumbled for her camera, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lens. Focusing on the 47th floor, she snapped a series of photos. The shutter clicks echoed unnaturally in the stillness of the room. When she reviewed the images, her stomach churned. In the first few shots, the window was empty, but in the final photo, a handprint pressed against the glass, a stark, pale outline against the black void. The next morning, Emma was determined to understand what she had seen. She visited the library, scouring old newspapers for any mention of Summit Tower. Most of the articles praised its innovative design and luxurious amenities, but one headline stood out. Construction worker plunges to death. Witnesses report strange behavior before fatal fall. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the pages. The article detailed the death of Alan Harper, a laborer who had been working on the 47th floor. Colleagues described him as increasingly paranoid in the weeks leading up to his death, muttering about a watcher and refusing to approach certain parts of the site. Emma closed the book, her mind racing. The dark window wasn't just a design flaw. It had a history, a presence that went beyond its appearance. As she left the library, the sky was a dull gray, the sun struggling to pierce through the clouds. Her unease deepened as she approached her building. The moment she stepped into her apartment, the familiar sense of wrongness returned. She set her bag down and froze. Her sketchbook lay open on the coffee table, even though she distinctly remembered closing it. The charcoal drawing of the skyline had changed. The dark window now dominated the page, its edges blurred as though it had bled into the paper, and in the center, faint but undeniable, was the shape of a figure. Its head was tilted as if it were watching her. The unease that had nestled in Emma's chest over the past few days was now a suffocating weight. Her apartment, once a sanctuary filled with her artistic chaos, felt wrong in ways she couldn't describe. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint buzz of the fluorescent kitchen light, felt amplified, as if the air itself carried a charge. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, the photograph from the library trembling in her hands. The grainy image of Summit Tower under construction seemed to pulse under her gaze. The dark window on the 47th floor, already present even before the building was finished. She traced the faint blur near the window with her finger, a smudge that she knew wasn't an error. It was the figure, she was sure of it. The words of the article echoed in her mind. He kept saying it was watching him. The laborer's paranoia, the muttered warnings, the eventual plunge to his death. It all led back to the same place. Emma closed her eyes and took a deep breath, willing her heartbeat to slow. But even with her eyes shut, she felt its presence. That window, that void, that impossible thing was etched into her thoughts like a brand. By mid-afternoon, Emma found herself pacing her apartment, the walls closing in with every step. She couldn't ignore the feeling that she was being watched, even though she hadn't opened her curtains all day. The logical part of her brain insisted that this was just paranoia, a spiral fueled by lack of sleep and too much caffeine. But logic did little to quiet the tapping she swore she could hear when the apartment fell silent. Desperate for answers, Emma grabbed her laptop and began digging deeper into the history of Summit Tower. The search was slow, the articles frustratingly vague. Most focused on the building's architectural achievements, glossing over the setbacks during its construction. Then she found it, a blog post, buried deep in an obscure forum about urban legends, detailed rumors surrounding the tower. The post was riddled with typos and dramatic flair, but one sentence stood out. They say the 47th floor was cursed before the tower was ever built. Workers refused to finish the job, claiming they felt like someone was standing behind them whenever they approached the window. Emma's blood ran cold as she continued reading. The post referenced the site's history, describing how an old tenement building had once stood where Summit Tower now rose. The tenement had been demolished after a series of strange disappearances, with one resident reportedly claiming that the window watches back before vanishing entirely. That night, Emma couldn't resist the pull of the dark window. She sat in her usual spot on the windowsill, her camera perched on its tripod, aimed directly at the 47th floor. She had debated with herself for hours, wavering between the need to know and the dread of what she might find. Curiosity won out. The camera's live feed flickered on her laptop screen, showing nothing unusual at first, just the dark window, as blank and lifeless as always. She watched intently, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. And then it happened. A shadow moved across the glass, subtle but deliberate. Emma's breath hitched as she leaned closer, her eyes glued to the screen. The shadow paused, lingering in the center of the window, its shape distorted and incomplete, like a smudge left by an oily hand. She snapped a photo, then another, her hands shaking so badly the camera wobbled on its tripod. When she reviewed the images, her stomach churned. The first photo showed the shadow as she had seen it, amorphous and vague. But in the second, the shadow had changed. It was no longer shapeless. It was humanoid, with elongated limbs and a head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face, or where a face should have been, was nothing but a void. Emma's laptop screen flickered, the live feed glitching briefly before stabilizing. She glanced at the screen, and her blood froze. The figure was no longer in the window. It was standing behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty. Her heart thundered as she scanned the shadows, every creak of the floorboards making her flinch. But there was nothing there. When she turned back to her laptop, the live feed was black. Emma barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the dark window. In the dream, it wasn't just a window. It was a doorway, its black surface rippling like water. The figure stood behind it, its head tilting in slow, deliberate motions, as if inviting her closer. She woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her skin damp and clammy. The apartment was silent, save for the faint hum of her laptop. She hesitated before approaching it, dreading what she might see. When she checked the photos again, they were gone. The files had corrupted overnight, leaving behind nothing but static-filled thumbnails. Emma felt like she was unraveling. She avoided her sketchbook, afraid of what she might find there, and left her curtains drawn tight. But even in the safety of daylight, she couldn't shake the sensation that the window was still watching her. A knock at the door startled her. She jumped, her pulse spiking, before realizing it was Julie. "Emma, what the hell is going on?" Julie demanded, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "You're not answering my calls, and you look like you haven't slept in days." Emma tried to brush her off, but Julie wasn't having it. She glanced around the apartment, her eyes narrowing at the disarray, the unopened sketchbooks, the scattered photos, the curtains drawn tight against the sunlight. "You need to get out of here," Julie said firmly. "You're spiraling, Em. Whatever's going on, it's not worth losing your mind over." Emma wanted to agree, to pack a bag and leave the apartment behind. But she couldn't. The dark window was a hook lodged deep in her psyche, pulling her back every time she tried to let go. Julie sighed, her expression softening. "At least let me stay the night, okay?" You shouldn't be alone right now. Emma nodded, too tired to argue. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't help. Whatever was happening to her, it wasn't something anyone else could stop. That night, as Julie slept on the couch, Emma sat at her window, staring out at Summit Tower. The dark window stared back. Darkness felt different that night, heavier, as if the city itself had shifted beneath its weight. Emma sat cross-legged on her windowsill, her knees tucked to her chest. The dark window on the 47th floor of Summit Tower loomed across the street, its silent presence commanding her attention. Julie had left earlier in the day after another unsuccessful attempt to convince Emma to leave the apartment. Emma hadn't argued. What was the point? How could she explain to anyone what she herself barely understood? Julie's concern felt like an anchor, pulling Emma further into a reality she was desperate to escape. The only thing that mattered now was the dark window. It had started to move again, not constantly and not overtly, but Emma had seen it, fleeting ripples like shadows shifting within the glass, too subtle for anyone but her to notice. It was watching her, she was certain of that now. But more than that, it was waiting. For what? She couldn't say. Her laptop sat open on the coffee table, displaying her latest attempt at capturing the phenomenon. She had set up her camera again, the live feed angled directly at the dark window. For hours, she'd sat and stared, waiting for the faintest flicker. And now, there it was. The shadow was back, a faint outline moving behind the black pane. Emma leaned forward, her breath shallow. The shadow's movements were deliberate, purposeful, as though it were pacing. She hit the record button on the live feed, her heart hammering in her chest. But then it stopped. The shadow stilled, and for a moment, Emma thought she'd imagined it. But then it turned. Slowly, deliberately, it turned to face her, or at least she thought it did. Its head tilted at that same unnatural angle, a gesture she had come to associate with the watcher. And then it raised a hand. Emma froze. The figure's hand pressed against the inside of the glass, its long, distorted fingers splayed wide. It stayed there for a moment before curling one finger, a beckoning motion. Emma didn't remember leaving her apartment. The next thing she knew, she was standing in the lobby of Summit Tower, her camera bag slung over one shoulder. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above her, casting sterile shadows across the marble floors. The receptionist's desk was empty, and the security guard she'd bribed the last time was nowhere to be seen. The building felt hollow, abandoned despite its grandeur. The silence pressed against her ears, broken only by the faint sound of her own breathing. She hesitated before approaching the elevator, her finger hovering over the call button. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave before it was too late. But she couldn't. The pull of the dark window was stronger than her fear. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Emma stepped inside. The ride to the 47th floor was agonizingly slow. The lights above flickered sporadically, and the hum of the machinery seemed to grow louder with each passing second. When the doors opened, the air changed. It was colder here, the chill biting through her hoodie and sinking into her bones. The hallway was dimly lit, the concrete walls unfinished and rough. A faint metallic smell lingered in the air, sharp and unpleasant. The dark window waited at the end of the corridor. Emma walked slowly, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The closer she got, the more the atmosphere shifted. The air felt thicker, like wading through invisible water, and the metallic tang grew stronger, burning her throat with every breath. When she reached the window, she stopped. It was different up close. The The darkness was no longer opaque. It rippled faintly like liquid obsidian. Emma could see her reflection in the glass, distorted and wrong. Her features were stretched, her eyes too wide, her mouth twisted into an expression she didn't recognize. The shadow appeared again, rising from the depths of the blackness. It moved with unnatural fluidity, its limbs too long, its head tilting in that familiar way. Emma's reflection shifted, mimicking the shadow rather than her own movements. "You came," a voice whispered, though Emma couldn't tell if it came from the glass or her own mind. Her knees trembled, but she didn't move. The shadow pressed its hand against the glass, and Emma felt the cold radiating from the surface. It beckoned again, and this time she obeyed. Her hand reached out, trembling as it pressed against the window. The surface was icy and alive, a faint vibration pulsing beneath her palm. The darkness rippled. The world shifted around her. One moment, she was standing in the hallway. The next, she was somewhere else. The air was heavy, suffused with a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her chest. The space was vast and infinite, a void filled with fractured reflections. Emma saw herself everywhere, shattered images of her face, her body, her movements, all distorted and twisted. The shadow loomed in the distance, its form growing more defined with every step it took. "You look too long," the voice whispered again, closer now. Emma tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The shadow was in front of her, its featureless face inches from hers. It reached out, its hand cupping her chin with an icy grip. "You belong to me now." The darkness surged forward, swallowing her whole. When Emma woke, she was back in her apartment. At first, she thought it had all been a dream. The familiar chaos of her living room surrounded her, her sketches scattered across the floor. But when she looked out the window, she knew the truth. The dark window on the 47th floor was gone. In its place, a normal pane of glass reflected the city lights. For the first time in weeks, the building looked ordinary. But when Emma turned away, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Her head was tilted, her eyes too wide, and her lips curled into a smile that wasn't her own.